drawn and redrawn, the making of India's internal boundaries.
Hi, and welcome back to India's State Stories, a project that explores the evolution of India's political and administrative boundaries. This project is supported by the Center for Legislative Education and Research, Flame University, Pune. The first series takes you on a journey through some of the most dramatic transitions in modern South Asian history. The British paramountcy over princely states, from the early days of alliance making to the chaotic months leading to India's independence, partition, and the accession of princely states. Between 1757 and 1947, the British didn't just rule over territories they directly annexed, they also exercised indirect control over more than 560 princely states through a complex web of subsidiary alliances, political treaties, and layered sovereignty. This series unpacks the story in 6 tightly woven episodes. We begin by tracing how fragmented kingdoms and chieftaincies were gradually brought under the indirect British rule. Through alliances, protectorate treaties, and the doctrine of lapse, the British forged a system of indirect control that allowed native princes to retain their thrones while ceding sovereignty. Each episode of our podcast is based upon corresponding well-researched article written by our team at India State Stories. These articles have been converted into audio conversations with the help of Google's Notebook LM. You can find the relevant article link in the show notes below. Let's dive into the conversation.
Okay, just try and picture this for a second. India, right at the moment of independence, 1947. You probably think, okay, unified nation. Finally free from colonial rule, but the reality, much, much messier. Imagine a huge jigsaw puzzle, yeah. But with over 560 separate pieces, each with its own ruler, its own rules, and this really complex relationship with the British who were leaving is kind of a mind-boggling image, isn't it? And it really sets the scene perfectly for our deep dive today. We're going to unpack this often, overlooked part of Indian history, a whole legacy of these princely states. Our mission really is to get a handle on how they even came about, what it actually meant to be one under British rule, and crucially, the massive challenge they posed to India's leaders after independence. This wasn't just about getting political freedom. It was this enormous job of stitching together, well, basically a whole subcontinent. We've looked at some fascinating historical accounts, official papers, including key stuff like V.P. Menon's big work, The Story of Integration of Indian States. So let's get into it. Before the British were really the main power, India.
Well, it's a huge place. Geographically, one thing. But politically, never really unified, was it? What did that pre-colonial map actually look like? How fragmented are we talking?
That's absolutely the place to start. It's fascinating because the fragmentation was already there long before the British, took full control. After Aurangzeb died, 1707, I think, the Mughal Empire started to seriously decline. You got widespread anarchy in much of the north. Then the Marathas, they expanded, built up a confederacy, controlled big chunks of North India and the Deccan. But then their power faded too, especially after that big battle, the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761. So what you had left was an even more fractured, sort of decentralized landscape, a real power vacuum.
Right. So a really diverse mix of powers, often fighting each other. It kind of paints the picture for how the British East India Company managed to step in. How exactly did they leverage that disunity?
Well, they were masters of exploiting the situation, really. From, say, 1757 onwards after Plassey, that key battle, right up to 1857, the company was just incredibly good at using the existing anarchy, the political divisions, the rivalries between states. They expanded their control bit by bit, sometimes through direct annexation, just taking territory, other times through treaties or these special deals like subsidiary alliances and saneds. And what emerged was this unique two-track system, direct rule in the areas they called provinces, and then this indirect rule through all these hundreds of princely states.
Okay, that idea of indirect rule,
yeah,
that's where it gets really interesting, I think. It sounds like a way to control without having to, manage every little detail. How did that grow into this big concept of British paramountcy? And what did it mean for the princes themselves? They still have their thrones, right?
Exactly. If we zoom out a bit, the system really started taking shape after 1757, but it became, let's say, official policy by around 1819. That's when British paramountcy became the established reality over most of India. Lord Hastings, he was a governor-general, played a big role. He kind of shifted the policy away from just grabbing land, annexing everything, towards what he called subordinate isolation.
Subordinate isolation, what's that?
It basically meant the states were part of the British Empire, vital cogs in the machine, but they weren't formally annexed. They kept their own internal administration, but always, always under the ultimate authority of the British Crown.
And those terms you mentioned, subsidiary alliances, SANADs.
Right. A subsidiary alliance typically meant a state had to pay for British troops stationed there and crucially give up control over its foreign policy. They became protectorates, essentially. And SANADs, those were basically guarantees from the British that a ruler could adopt an heir if they didn't have a natural one.
So that stopped the British just annexing the state if the ruler died without a son.
Precisely. It was a way to keep the states in existence, under British oversight.
So the rulers kept their titles, their palaces, managed internal stuff, but the real power was limited. I think Gandhi had a quote about this, didn't he? Captures it really well.
He did, yeah. Famously said the princes were like men who could not breathe without the permission of the crown. It's a powerful image, highlights just how dependent they were, despite all the outward appearances of sovereignty. The British kept very tight control through their political department. This was staffed by, top civil servants, army officers, and they placed political agents, British officials, in all the key states or groups of states. These agents were the eyes and ears and often the guiding hand. So the prince's actual power, heavily restricted. Defense, foreign affairs, even major communications projects, all controlled by the British. Their own people weren't even technically British subjects. They were called British protected persons.
Wow. That really underlines their unique sort of limbo status. It paints a clear picture. Control behind a veil of autonomy. So fast forward to 1947, independence is looming. What did this map actually look like? You said over 560 of these entities scattered all over. How do you even begin to unify that?
The scale is just immense, you're right. Geographically, yeah, scattered everywhere. They made up about 45% of India's total land area. That's, roughly 1.85 million square kilometers out of 4.35 million total. Huge. And they varied wildly. You had massive states like Hyderabad, bigger than England itself, and then tiny little states, sometimes no bigger than a village. Many were seen as quite backward, still operating on feudal lines, limited services for the people. But, it's important to say there were exceptions. Some states like Kolhapur, Baroda, Mysore, they actually brought in some quite progressive reforms.
Really? Ahead of British India sometimes.
In some ways, yes. Democratic reforms, social changes. It wasn't a completely uniform picture of stagnation.
That's fascinating. A huge area, huge population, under wildly different types of rule. And the views on the rulers themselves, Nehru and Gandhi calling them autocrats, some British officials calling them Oriental despots. Did the British try to simplify this? Or did they actually kind of encourage the fragmentation? It seems almost counterproductive.
Well, after the 1857 mutiny, British policy actually shifted. They realized these princely states could be useful allies, buffers against future unrest. So instead of simplifying, they started to almost multiply the number of states and solidify the system. They handed out more SANs, those adoption guarantees we talked about, and they started recognizing even very small, petty chieftains as rulers of their own state.
So they actively increased the fragmentation.
Pretty much, yeah. And the result was this incredibly complex mess. Different jurisdictions, internal customs barriers, different currencies, laws. Imagine trying to build a national railway or plan the economy. Every few miles, you hit a new border, new rules, new taxes.
A nightmare for development.
Absolutely. It created huge internal barriers, stifled any kind of large-scale planning for centuries. And many of the smaller states, frankly, just didn't have the money or the capacity to run themselves properly, provide basic services. They weren't really viable on their own.
It sounds like chaos waiting to happen, especially for an independent India. Given all this complexity, were there any serious attempts to maybe bring the states together or reform them before 1947?
It was definitely a recognized problem. The British did try sort of to impose some structure. They set up the Chamber of Princes in 1921.
What was that?
It was meant to be an advisory body, had about 108 rulers who were members directly, the big ones, basically, with gun salutes of 11 guns or more, plus another 12 princes elected to represent about 127 smaller states.
Did it achieve much?
Honestly, not really. It was structurally weak, and the princes themselves were too divided, couldn't agree on much. There was also the Butler Committee, which tried to classify all the 562 states into different categories based on their power. Just highlights the complexity again.
Okay, so attempts, but not very effective. What about pressure from within India? from the nationalist movement? Were they pushing for change in the states? Sounds like most rulers weren't too keen on giving up power.
No, most rulers definitely resisted reforms. They clung onto their traditional powers, often without much popular support from their own people. The Indian National Congress, initially, they had a policy of non-interference. They focused on British India.
Why was that?
It was complicated, partly tactical, partly respecting the technical separation, but by the late 1930s, that changed. Leaders like Gandhi and especially Sardar Patel, they realized you couldn't have an independent India that ignored nearly half the territory and population, so they started actively pushing for democratic reforms within the states. There was even a plan in the Government of India Act of 1935 for a federation, bringing British India and the princely states together.
That didn't happen.
Never came into force. Why? Largely because the princes themselves wouldn't support it. They didn't want to give up their autonomy to a central Indian government.
Right. So after all this history, this unique system, what happens when independence finally arrives in 1947? What's the fate of these 500-plus states?
This is the absolute crunch point. The Indian Independence Act of 1947. This piece of legislation was key. It formally ended British suzerainty, that whole system of paramountcy, the overarching British control, gone. And critically, it declared all the treaties and agreements between the British Crown and the states null and void. Meaning, technically, legally, each one of those 560-odd states became independent, completely free.
Independent, like their own countries?
Technically, yes. They were free to decide their own future, join India, join the newly created Pakistan, or try to remain independent sovereign nations.
Wow. So for the new leaders of India, like Nehru and Patel, this wasn't just about taking over from the British. It was this massive, unprecedented problem suddenly dropped in their laps. How do you build a nation out of that?
Exactly that. The fragmented political map, carefully built and maintained by the British for nearly 200 years, suddenly became probably the single biggest headache for independent India's leadership. The task of achieving political unity, administrative integration, it was just monumental, especially for Sardar Patel, who really took the lead on this. Imagine trying to persuade, cajole, sometimes pressure, over 560 rulers, each with their own history, their own army, in some cases, their own laws, to merge into a single new nation. Almost overnight.
It's staggering, a testament to their skill that they managed it. Really, it really is incredible when you think about it. The sheer complexity of India's birth, not just freedom from Britain, but solving this internal jigsaw puzzle of 560 pieces. This deep dive, it really underscores how historical policies, even ones that seem stable at the time, can create these huge, long-lasting challenges.
Yeah, what's so striking is how this system of princely states, which the British ran for, 180 years, seemed stable. But in the end, it was the biggest single barrier to India actually becoming a unified country after independence. It took extraordinary diplomacy, huge determination, and a really clear vision to overcome that fragmentation. It wasn't guaranteed at all.
So something to think about as we wrap up. How different might the history of the subcontinent have been? What if the British had just annexed all those states much earlier? Or what if the states had somehow achieved real independence much sooner? How might things look today? And maybe what lessons can we draw from this massive, complicated process of unification for other parts of the world that are still dealing with internal divisions or the legacies of old borders?